Hi, thanks for coming. Again, my name is Kim Schlesinger. This is my colleague, Sarah Zelechoski, and we're going to be talking about how to align teams to monitor an application ecosystem. Maybe. All right. So DevOps is the dream, but when you can't make cross-functional agile teams a reality, you're going to have to foster collaboration between several different teams and potentially two different companies. This is hard though, especially when navigating this relationship, the fuzzy line between infrastructure and application uptime and monitoring. Here's a real example. I work on an ops team, and someone on a dev team that we partner with sent us a message with this graph. The message said, hey, ops folks, can you help us figure out why our applications went from 10 Kubernetes pods to 125 in just a few minutes? Later, I'll talk more about how we worked together to figure out this issue, but we were able to come together and solve this problem because we had strong interpersonal relationships and a set of shared tools. For monitoring to lead to resolution of issues, separate ops and dev teams must build relationships between people, use processes to increase communication, and leverage a shared set of tools. Sarah and I work at a company called Fairwinds. Fairwinds is a managed service company which provides its customers with expertly managed Kubernetes and cloud-native infrastructure. Our mission is to help our customers' software teams develop, test, and deploy their products faster and monitor them more reliably. We've partnered with approximately 90 companies since 2015, and we've developed our approach to team collaboration because we've had the opportunity to try it so many different ways. We've also developed some best practices that we'd like to share with you. A little bit about me. I'm Kim. My pronouns are she, her. I live in Broomfield, Colorado, and I'm a site reliability engineer at Fairwinds.
And I'm Sarah. You can call me Sarah Z. It's very hard for people to say my last name, so just go with that. My pronouns are also she, her, and I live in Western Massachusetts. My role at Fairwinds is VP of Engineering. So today we've organized this talk into 3 separate sections: people, process, and tools. It's a framework that we've borrowed from Chris Short in his weekly DevOps-ish newsletter. So we're going to start at the heart of all things, the people. How do they interact to make this work? Fairwinds at its core is a service company. We're not a software company, and so we're very people-focused. For us, service means humans helping other humans. And we take great care in developing culture to help us attain the following outcomes. Both dev and ops teams are willing participants in a strong partnership. Shared goals and direction are key to both teams' identity, and both teams, or all teams, are thoughtful and accountable to each other for their actions. There's 3 cultural foundations that we're going to recommend today to achieve these outcomes. Our first recommendation is to develop a group narrative. One of the things that we think is really important when you bring 2 disparate teams together is to develop that group narrative. This can help teams understand a common history, things that they've struggled with in the past, what their shared values are, et cetera. It can help them clarify a shared purpose, and it can aid in building a united group identity. When we develop a group narrative, generally at Fairwinds, we start with a history lesson. 2 teams coming together, they need to understand each other, and they have to understand where they've come from. What have they struggled with in the past? What have they excelled with in the past? What is missing from their relationship? And if they're faced with that past, it's generally much easier for them to envision a better future. We also like to share with people the epiphany, that moment when you're like, something has to change, or this isn't going to work. It's very eye-opening to folks to hear why you're coming together in that place, in that time, to make things better. The second thing that we want to do when you're developing a group narrative is to cast a relatable vision. You want folks to know the problems that you're trying to solve going forward, and it's important for them to envision the type of environment that you're going to be creating together. You want to dig into how you're going to make things better, essentially. When you're casting that vision, we found it very useful to insert symbolism. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. You want to give people a touchstone, small things that mean big, important things, so that they can remember and take that back with them to their everyday work. It's easier for them to be involved if they can latch onto that idea. And then the last thing is everyone should be able to tell that story. Every single employee on both teams should know this group narrative, what their story is, who the characters are, what the morals are, what the themes are. They need to understand where they come from, where they're going, and what role they play in that relationship. And then, of course, at any one time, in their tenure with you, they may need to tell that story to someone else. And every time that they repeat it, it reinforces that idea in their head. At Fairwinds, we have a culture deck that chronicles our group narrative. In it, we learn about the history of our teams, early struggles that we had, moments of inspiration, etc. The story tells us why our teams work together the way that they do, what values are important to us, and we cast vision about an organization with shared goals. In the deck, there's a powerful metaphor that compares a harmonious engineering group to a bee colony. We talk about the qualities of a beehive, that it's a place of collaboration, a place of efficiency, selflessness, adaptability, et cetera. And all the while, we're asking engineers to think about how those qualities affect them and their work and the teams that they work on. Everybody walks away with that story very clear in their mind, and the bee has become a very powerful symbol for us in recalling that group narrative. We go the extra distance and leverage that symbol in many aspects of our work so that it's a constant kind of reminder of our story. Plus, it's really cute, and it helps us recall our identity and really be mindful in everything that we do. Much like fans of a sports team, we rally behind our mascot, right? Okay, so our second recommendation is to commit to a set of shared values. After you've successfully created a story that brings your dev and ops teams together and sets kind of that tone and the stage for working together, now you have to create an actually actionable base for your interactions. So our next recommendation is really to focus on creating that set of shared values and making sure that you define what's important. Shared values provide guidance, right? They guide your decision-making, they act as an ethical compass for people's actions, et cetera, and so they're extremely important. The first thing you want to do when you go about creating this set of shared values is to ask yourself really challenging questions. How do you want to be treated? What do you want to be known for? Who do you want to have a seat at the table? How can you be really successful together? In our experience, it's really a good idea to be vulnerable and address those human factors that are really important to you. And be sure when you're creating this set of values to include both your dev and your ops teams. The greater group is going to have a different set of shared values than each subculture. When you're creating this set of shared values, you want to make sure that you're designing human interaction versus defining what human skills your teams have, right? You're deciding how you're going to treat each other, how to judge your behavior. And I've seen companies have values like enthusiasm or creativity, right? And those are great skills for your employees to have. But every interaction that you have with your team, does that have to be creative? No, not necessarily. There's a lot of boring stuff that happens too, right? You want to make sure that you're focusing on how people treat each other and what those values are. At Fairwinds, we focus on more general skills, or we focus on generals versus specifics. The idea is that for us, it's easier to apply a general category to many different behaviors and actions versus kind of nitpicking, that behavior doesn't necessarily fit that particular value, et cetera, et cetera. So try to avoid being litigious and just go for generals. It's also really important to kind of keep your list short. We recommend 3 or 4 values. It makes things easier to remember. People can recall it more quickly. And when they go about their daily work life, they can think about it in every action that they do. Does this align with our values? It's also extremely helpful, I think, to create an acronym that will help people remember it. And if it's funny, that usually helps too. And then lastly, it's great to create that list, right? But that's not what this is about. It's committing to that list of shared values. At Fairwinds, all of our values are written in our handbook, and everybody has to sign a signature saying that they've read it and that they agree to it. The expectation is set that their actions are going to be judged on those values, and everybody is signing up for that. Our hope, of course, is that people really do end up valuing them and they think it's important, but at least in the beginning, commitment is the first step. And of course, that commitment needs to be carried out at all levels of the organization, not just leadership. Yeah, I don't know if this counts as Rick-rolling all of you. But I did want to give you a glimpse of Fairwinds' shared values. This is an actual slide from my culture deck. Our values are respect, inclusion, compassion, and kindness. If you think about those, they are those generals that we talked about, right? You can apply these to a lot of different interactions in your company. It's super easy to remember. It has some symbolism attached. I know it doesn't go with the B theme, but I'm pretty attached to it. These values not only help our SRE team build kind of a joyful internal culture, but also it heavily shapes the way that we interact with our customers, those dev teams that we interact with. And our third and last recommendation in the way of people is self-regulation. If you take our first two recommendations, you're going to be well on your way to developing a healthy culture where dev and ops folks can share a purpose, share direction, and act according to those shared values. But that can't be the end of it, right? At Fairwinds, as we grow and add employees and build relationships with more customers, we can't just hope that that culture moves forward. Culture is a learned behavior, and everyone has to participate in making that culture a reality and moving it forward. And so we expect all of our engineers and our customers to help regulate and keep that culture tuned in to the shared values and that group narrative that we talked about. In an effort to support that type of grassroots relationship management, we've developed a few simple prompts that allow our individuals to easily enforce those shared values. I'm going to show you in a minute what our prompts are, but they're designed to be simple and frictionless. The easier it is for somebody to take action, the more likely that people are going to do it. We kind of try to think of them as small course corrections to bump people back onto the path. We set the expectations that the prompts are intended to be non-confrontational, and you agree ahead of time with your teams that those prompts are for introspection, not conflict. People need to stop and think about what they're doing versus kind of get it going on the defensive. We frame that as a part of our continuous improvement and feedback cycle, and everybody should feel like they're equally open to feedback. The first prompt that we use at Fairwinds is the bee emoji, of course. This leverages the symbolism from our group narrative. If somebody in our culture gives you the bee emoji, it means that you've done something that exemplifies our values or our story. It's a shout out, it's a thank you. That simple emoji is kind of a reinforcement that helps encourage people to take certain behaviors, and it reminds them what our teams are trying to do together. Hopefully you can see this. This is an example of somebody calling somebody else out with the bee emoji. In this particular case, Micah has been called out for knowing what work needs to be done and taking it upon himself to do it without being directed. And that directly reflects some of the themes from our group narrative. So he says, "So B for Micah." And then people respond with a B, which is another cool. Our second prompt is the opposite of the B emoji. In this case, it's a simple phrase, "We don't do that here," which is intended to stop somebody that may be acting out of bounds of the shared values. This particular phrase is meant to be disarming and non-confrontational. If someone tells you "we don't do that here," that means that you need to stop and reflect on your behavior and perhaps discuss that misalignment with the person or manager. Here's an example of us doing that. In this particular case, an operations person was suggesting a solution that was not in the best interest of a development team. As you can see, their team course corrected them by saying "we don't do that here." giving them a pretty simple reason as to why, and the person said, "You're right, good job." So those 2 prompts help our team do that self-regulation behavior where management doesn't have to step in and say you're doing well or you're doing badly, but everybody can kind of be on the same page and help each other out. Now that we laid a good foundation for how folks might collaborate together in a kind and compassionate way, let's move on to process and how we might help folks in that relationship now be successful in working together. At Fairwinds, we've developed a few simple yet effective processes that allow us to achieve the following outcomes. Both dev and ops teams understand and maintain their individual responsibilities while also helping each other in the gray area between. Dev and ops teams communicate openly and often, and all work happens in a transparent fashion. Understanding is built through sharing context. There's 3 processes we're going to recommend today, just as simple processes that can help you achieve these outcomes. Our first recommendation is to take the time to set clear expectations. Who owns what, who's responsible for what, and how you will share responsibilities. Oftentimes, I mean, that seems like a no-brainer, but oftentimes teams' roles are not well defined. They're not put on paper. And so that leads to a lot of confusion around who's monitoring what areas of your stack. If something falls over, you certainly don't want people saying, well, I thought you were watching it. And the other person says, I thought you were watching it, right? The other day I was looking at this list that showed the areas of responsibility of a dev versus an ops person. And under the responsibilities of the ops people, it said deploy. And I thought to myself, well, that's silly. Couldn't a developer be deploying their own application and monitoring their own application? Sure. I don't know why you have to block the developers by giving that one task to a specific person. At Fairwinds, we divide up teams by area of responsibility rather than tasks. That allows continuity in the life cycle of the application or the infrastructure. It allows the same people who are responsible for creating the application to be responsible for building it, testing it, deploying it, and monitoring it. Each team is kind of on call for their own area, which means that they're also invested in the quality of that. To give you an example, if you were to look up shared responsibility on Google, what you're generally going to find is a diagram like this, but for a cloud provider like Amazon or a platform as a service company. This diagram represents the split in areas of responsibility across our ops team and the dev teams that we interact with at Fairwinds. As you can see, we're not dividing up tasks like monitoring, but rather both teams take ownership for monitoring in their area of responsibility. We think that it makes it clear who's responsible for what, not necessarily who can do what, if that distinction is clear. Each group is on call for their areas of responsibility, and neither team is blocking of each other, even though they do have to work in concert to be successful. Now, to loop back to the title of our talk, there's a fuzzy line in between, right? On the ops side, you can see the areas of responsibility go cloud provider, networking, infrastructure as code, all the way up to infrastructure monitoring. On the dev side, you can see app config, secrets management, deployment of their app, all the way to app monitoring. But there's also that fuzzy line in the middle where we as technologists can acknowledge apps affect infrastructure. Infrastructure affects apps. We can't get away from it. So in that gray area, say a dev team is paged by an ops problem. Who's responsible? I think Alice mentioned this in her talk, right? How do you handle issues that cross that line or are somewhere in the middle? So as I mentioned, we define shared responsibility, right? At Fairwinds, we call that gray line the area of, the line of partnership. If issues cross that line and we don't know where the responsibility lies or who's responsible for what, we default to help, right? That's where we partner up with our dev teams to share the problem, come up with a solution together, and in fact, we're both responsible in that area. You can't just throw things over the wall, right? We gave our customers something that we call the people page. It's an email address that connects directly to PagerDuty. And probably a lot of you are saying, wow, that's really dangerous, right? If a customer's paged in the middle of the night for their application, they're going to wake up. They're going to bang their head on the desk. They're going to try to figure out everything that they can, whether they can fix it or not. And if at the end of the troubleshooting session, they think that maybe it leads to infrastructure, that's okay. They can page us. And so we give them the ability to do that. That's the place where we have to help. It doesn't happen very often, but this type of process helps fill in the gaps. The only way that you can achieve this is if both sides are willing to help, right? You have to help each other in these areas, and what that leads to is a really good sense of responsibility to each other. If an ops person can people page a dev person, then that's great, and they need to do their due diligence, right? Because it can also go the other way around, and you don't want people calling you if they haven't done their homework. Great.
All right, so our second recommendation for a process is setting up a shared Slack channel between teams. One of the things that allows our team to quickly communicate with our customers are single shared Slack channels. We set up these channels in our workspace and invite customers as single channel guests so they don't have access to any other channels at our company. The shared Slack channels are a space where we can enact our values with customers, and they enable us to work together more easily. We encourage folks at our company and our customers to ask all questions in these channels instead of sending direct messages between two people. This opens the relationship and normalizes the process of asking questions, quote unquote, aloud. Our channels are often busy during work hours because it's the place where we can troubleshoot issues together, either in real time or asynchronously. The shared channels are also a space where teams can alert one another of CVEs, planned upgrades, or upcoming changes in apps or services. When these channels are your primary means of written communication between teams, they're a really powerful tool for postmortems because there's a clear timeline of events as well as a record of how the teams communicated. If you're worried about these channels getting too noisy with side conversations, Sarah and I recommend you set some guidelines around this channel, say it's business-related messages only, and you can create some shared Slack channels for fun, like topic random or topic cute stuff, etc.
Find my mouse. Here we go. Even in today's day and age, when remote work is becoming more of the norm, FaceTime is still really important. And it doesn't mean you have to be in a conference room together. You can be in a Zoom chat together. But getting members of your dev and ops teams together in a synchronous fashion is really important. The longer teams go without syncing, the further they're going to fall behind in understanding the concerns and priorities and the needs of each other. We've found that teams can become disconnected with each other's work in as little as a week. And for that reason, at Fairwinds, we keep standing weekly meetings between our ops teams and all of our customers' dev teams. The most important reason that we leverage weekly syncs is transparency. Since our dev and ops teams are oftentimes doing work that affect each other, it's important to just simply know what's going on outside your team. Say, for example, our customers' developers are preparing for a big release, and they're probably going to get 3 times the amount of traffic that they normally get. Well, that's intel that we need, because scaling is notorious in that gray area, right? If deployments start eating resources or the database connections start getting saturated, it's going to cause all kinds of problems for infrastructure and probably alert our ops team. There's lots of ifs, of course, but we can't plan for them or proactively go after them if we don't know what's happening. Further, kind of by sharing, you get together in a meeting, you share your work items, you share your struggles, you share the decisions you're working on. You're just going to build better understanding between the two teams. It's that shared empathy. When folks are making technical decisions separately, it's really important to share that information together to just kind of paint the bigger picture for everyone. Also, kind of based on information shared by the teams in the weekly meetings, you can get an opportunity to sync your priorities. If, for example, the dev team's priority is to launch a new service, It makes a lot of sense to ensure that the ops team is prioritizing any complementary monitoring resources or any triage. We need to share the impact and value of our work in these weekly syncs, and that's something that we don't do enough. We really need to appreciate each other, dev teams and ops teams, right? You're each doing work that is valuable and impactful to each other, and just taking the opportunity to thank each other or to appreciate each other is really important. So we're gonna move into tools.
Great. So we've talked about what needs to be true about people, some processes you can leverage, and now we're gonna talk about some tools that we recommend. At Fairwinds, as we've reflected on the set of tools we've established, we see that they help us reach these outcomes. Monitoring infrastructure and workloads so that both teams can see and analyze the data. Both teams have confidence in that monitoring system, and decreasing the time to resolution when there's an issue. There are two tools we're going to recommend today. The first is a shared monitoring platform, and the second is a standardized set of monitors that are managed as code. So first recommendation, shared monitoring platform. Before our engagement with a customer, we define what parts of the ecosystem each time is responsible for monitoring and responding to. Then each team decides on how they would like to set up their monitors, when alerts are sent, and how the particular team responds to those alerts. Communicating about what is going well and what isn't is much easier if both teams are using a shared monitoring platform. At Fairwinds, we're responsible for monitoring the health of cloud infrastructure as well as Kubernetes-specific workloads. We send high-urgency alerts to PagerDuty and other alerts to Slack, and an SRE responds as needed. We don't keep track of the monitors that the dev teams we work with create because we trust their judgment. However, there's often that gray area we've alluded to. You may get paged from an alert that's been triggered in one area, like memory usage on a node is high, but the issue might need to be addressed by the other team, like an application has a memory leak that needs to be fixed. That gray area is so much easier to navigate if you have a shared monitoring platform because both teams have access to the full set of monitoring data. At Fairwinds, we like Datadog for several reasons. Datadog can take in lots of different kinds of data, like Kubernetes audit logs, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, and Azure data, Docker data, data from Istio and other service meshes, and application metrics. It has pre-made dashboards, and you can customize your own. It can also be easily connected with a platform like PagerDuty to notify engineers when a critical monitor has reached its alert threshold. So here are some example Datadog dashboards. This is the default Kubernetes dashboard. This is a custom Kubernetes dashboard that the site reliability engineers at Fairwinds use because we really care about CPU and memory usage for nodes and pods. This is an example of a custom service dashboard used for one of the dev teams that we partner with. It's for one of their microservices built with Node.js and Express, and these are the metrics that they care about. Ideally, there are dashboard views in the shared monitoring platform that act as a single pane of glass, but the tool can also allow teams to zoom out and zoom in and magnify data that they care about. So to illustrate the power of using a shared monitoring platform, I want to tell you a story, and because we're getting close to the end of October, it's a spooky one. It's called The Tale of the Phantom Scaling, and you'll recognize part of it from the beginning of the talk. In July of 2019, we made a plan with one of our customers to collaborate on switching their incoming customer traffic from being handled by AWS classic elastic load balancers to application load balancers so that the customer could use the more modern option. We devised this plan over the course of a couple of weeks during our regular sync meeting and in our shared Slack channel. Together, we decided that the dev team was responsible for deleting Cloudflare DNS records, and our team updated a CNAME record that originally sent traffic to the Elastic load balancer, but after the cutoff would send traffic to the application load balancers. On a Thursday afternoon, both teams took care of their part of the switch. The next day, though, something strange started happening with the pods receiving traffic from the application load balancers. the head of the other team sent us a message in our Slack channel saying something unusual is going on with the launch pods. And then he sent us a link to this Datadog graph. This shows the number of pods running for a Kubernetes deployment called launch. When the data spikes, the number of pods running went from 10 to 125. Examining and discussing this visualization led both teams to wonder if there was an actual spike in incoming traffic or if something strange was going on, so we created a shared dashboard. This is that dashboard. The top half of the dashboard are application metrics that the dev team uses. This client builds their apps with the LAMP stack, and they use Datadog to monitor Apache and PHP metrics, as well as keeping track of how many Kubernetes pods are running on the cluster. The bottom half of the dashboard is a set of metrics that we, the ops team, monitor, a count of the active connections being handled by the load balancers. The purple line represents traffic handled by the Elastic load balancer, and the turquoise line is the new application load balancers. Here's the actual moment of the cutover. You can see that the number of connections increases soon after the cutover, then drops for the weekend, and spikes again on Monday. There's no significant change in the dev data, though, with the exception of the number of pods running. The increased number of connections triggered the horizontal pod autoscaler to increase the number of pods, which then triggered the cluster autoscaler to increase the number of Kubernetes worker nodes until both hit their maximum limits. For a couple of days, we traded messages back and forth in our shared channel, and during our weekly sync, we came together with different hypotheses about what was causing the issue. Finally, the lead of the dev team determined that the application load balancers were creating 40% more connections per incoming request than the classic Elastic load balancers. After more discussion, the teams realized that one change that we had made in the original setup was that container health checks were being handled by an Nginx controller and not the applications. When we switched to the application load balancer, each instance of the application was handling the health checks and keeping those connections open then longer than before, which was drastically increasing the number of connections, which is the metric that we were scaling Kubernetes pods on. In the end, we had to change the scaling metrics to account for this change. The discovery of this issue required the special expertise of both the dev and the ops teams, and the main reason we were able to solve this problem was our cross-team relationship that was aided by the shared monitoring platform. This story illustrates some of the benefits of teams using a shared monitoring platform. The data visualizations support communications between teams. It can act as a single pane of glass, as well as giving teams options to focus on data that they really care about. And ultimately, the benefit is that you have increased opportunities for communication, which leads to reducing the time it takes to resolve issues. Although we use Datadog, there are other shared monitoring platforms. Honeycomb, Sensu, Sysdig, and New Relic are some of those alternatives. The second recommendation for tools is monitors as code. At Fairwinds, we have an internal tool called ROD, which is a set of templates of commonly used Datadog monitors that are written in YAML, then converted to Terraform, and then applied to our infrastructure and checked into source control. We work with clients to build their cloud infrastructures with AWS or Google Cloud Platform, and these are the families of monitors that we've created. These are the specific Kubernetes monitors that we create. This is a Terraform file for a Kubernetes cluster is running out of memory monitor, which we then can apply from the command line to create this Datadog monitor. So there are a lot of benefits to setting up monitors as code. One is repeatability. The same monitor can be applied in different environments, across different teams, or in our case, customers. Familiarity. Someone can tune the monitor or respond to an alert more quickly if they're familiar with the monitor and have that cognitive pattern, as opposed to panicking when they get paged. Reduces fuzzy lines in monitoring because others can look at your work as well as prior commits. Writing monitors as code and checking them into version control means that teams can collaborate on the monitors via pull requests and code reviews, which increases cross-team conversation. And finally, in general, monitoring dashboards are not well designed for people who use screen readers, but when a monitor is managed as code, someone using a screen reader can create or change a monitor through those text editors. So the tools that we recommend are a shared monitoring platform, as well as managing monitors as code.
They're telling me we're short on time, so I'm going to wrap this up. Hopefully, Kim's story helps illustrate that you can indeed navigate those fuzzy lines by focusing on aspects of people, process, and tools like we discussed today. From the helpful and patient collaboration between those two teams, all the way to the way that they shared information in Slack and weekly meetings, and then the way that they shared these dashboards and all of their monitoring data, you can see that all of the themes we talked about were woven into that one story. We're going to quickly recap some of the stuff that we've talked about today so that you can bring this home and potentially work on this with your teams. In our section on people, we discussed building a group narrative, committing to shared values, and working on self-regulation at all levels of your org. In process, we recommend explicitly defining areas of responsibility, communicating clearly and transparently through Slack and weekly syncs. And finally, in Kim's really spooky story, we learned that a shared monitoring platform and curating monitors as code can help you create powerful views into the space between those fuzzy lines. We're always looking for folks to join our team at Fairwinds, so please feel free to check out our careers page and watch our culture video. And if you're interested in any of the resources we mentioned today, these links are going to be in our slides that will be posted. You can watch our Twitter profiles for them as well. And on behalf of Kim and myself, thank you for joining us today.
We do have time for a few questions. If anyone has questions, please step up to the mic. All right.
Great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a class of services that sort of fit in between dev teams and ops teams, like databases. We've been approaching that by trying to create like a golden road for the use of the database, even up to and including like designing the DAO in Java so that they can just import it as a library. Where does that fit in, or does it fit in?
Great question. So in our experience, we like our managers to manage their databases for a lot of different reasons. But at the end of the day, what happens is that it's important to their business use case, right? And their application teams are responsible for the majority of the data that goes in and the transformation that happens in the data, right? And so similarly, we generally expect the application developers to have insight into the life cycle of the data and what happens in the database. I think we can cheat a little bit on this because we generally use cloud providers, and cloud providers have beautiful databases, as Alice mentioned in the keynote. But that's a really challenging area, and what I would recommend is that chart we had of the defined responsibilities. Have a really hard conversation and decide who owns what.
Any more questions? Real quick.
Yeah, I was curious about the shared values and the ones you guys decided to use and the process you elected to prioritize the shared values, because there might be differences between dev and ops teams.
Sure.
Especially in terms of dev teams might value faster development over being more careful, as ops teams might be.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take that, or shall I?
Go ahead.
So I think that kind of goes back to our point about trying to define the way that people treat each other versus how they do their work, right? So they may value fastness, but does that mean every time that you talk to them, like you have to go really fast and like get things done? No, not necessarily. The way that we came up with our values is actually, if you listen to our group narrative, we have a history toiled in engineers being one type of engineer and not having a diverse group of folks and missing pieces of experience or perspectives in our team. And so you'll notice in our values, respect, inclusion, compassion, and kindness, it has a lot to do with bringing more people to the table and respecting differences and having more opinions and a better rounded perspective Compassion and kindness come from us being a service company and knowing that every customer who comes to us has a problem. And if we don't have compassion for them, there's no way that we can understand them and work together with them, if that answers your question.
Awesome. Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, just join me again in please giving a second round of applause to Kim and Sarah.